game professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. Today, we ask ourselves one of the most contentious questions currently being asked in the video game industry and community. What exactly is a video game? It's a debate that hasn't sparked quite as much controversy as do video games make our kids violent, nor has it inspired quite as many death threats as should we treat women like actual people, but nevertheless it is a very hotly debated and commonly discussed topic that has a lot to do with how this medium is going to develop. This question has existed for a good long while, but it really entered the public eye with the release of Dear Esther in 2012. The game consisted of little more than walking around an island and listening to narration, with no challenges to overcome, no ways to die or fail, and the game is finished simply by walking through its environments to the ending. The positive response led to the creation of a whole genre of similar titles, while the negative response resulted in that genre being referred to as walking simulators. From games like the Stanley Parable, to Gone Home, to Passage, and even to modern cinematic adventure games like Heavy Rain, this debate has raged on. What is a game? Do video games technically need to be games? How do we treat a video game that doesn't fit within the typical definition? A game has a number of different ways to define it. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines a game as a physical or mental activity or contest that has rules and that people do for pleasure. On the other hand, influential game designer Sid Meier once defined a game simply as a series of interesting choices. But definitions tend to change over time, and video games, being a new, developing art form and all that, are no exception. So it might be beneficial for us to go over some of the typical characteristics of a traditionally defined game. Games have been around a whole lot longer than video games, obviously, so we have plenty of material to work with. Looking at any variety of games from chess to basketball, we can see plenty of common threads. Games have a goal: get X amount of points, eliminate the enemy team, get this item to this location, etc., and whoever achieves this goal wins the game. Games have challenges. The goal is difficult to achieve because of others competing over it or because of challenging barriers placed in the way. Games have rules. Some actions are allowed, and some are not, and others are allowed only in certain circumstances, and all these rules are how the game's goals and challenges are structured. And finally, games have fail states. At some point, it is possible to fail at your objective and lose the game. Now, game theory is obviously significantly more complex than that, but this is enough of a basic framework for us to work with, and we can see these principles at work in both traditional games and video games. For instance, in a game of chess, your goal is to capture the king. Doing so wins the game. The other player has the same goal, and if they accomplish it, you lose. Their pieces and movements are the challenges you must overcome to win, and the ways each piece is allowed to move constitute the rules by which you must do so. And in a game of Overwatch, your objective might be to capture 2 points on a map, one after the other. Accomplishing the objective will win the game, failing to do so in the time limit will lose the game. But there's another team of people who are trying to stop you from doing that, and that's the challenge you must overcome to win. The game has lots of rules, like which abilities each character has, how high you can jump, how much damage a given attack uses, etc. So the same basic concepts behind traditional games apply to video games too, and we can see this same structure across most video games, from Super Mario Bros. To Red Dead Redemption. Now, video games have often played pretty fast and loose with these concepts, but they've generally stuck to them. In old arcade games like Pac-Man, for instance, these elements are all present, except that there's not really a way to truly win the game. You can complete a given map, but the game just keeps going until you die. You have a goal, but the game doesn't end when you complete it, but when you inevitably fail. That said, these elements are still present, and Pac-Man pretty easily falls within the traditional definition of a game. It's also a noteworthy aside that video games allow for a bit more variety and complexity in single-player experiences. Previously, games tended to rely on other people to provide the competition and challenge, and if you were playing a game alone, you were probably either competing against luck in games like Solitaire, or just trying to figure out a puzzle, like in a Sudoku or word searches or anything like that. Video games can have a bit more complexity in how they present challenges to single people playing the game. But now that we've got a basic handle on the nature of a game, we need to get a similar handle on the nature of a video game. The two are obviously connected, but the prevailing assumption, especially outside of the video game community, is that there's something of a one-to-one correlation. Like, video games are just games that take place on a digital plane instead of a physical one, and it could be argued that that was accurate at first. Maybe. But even if it was, it certainly didn't stay like that for long. As they developed, video games tended to learn more from tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons than from sports, or even really from board games. Sometime I might do a whole episode on how each of these influenced the development of video games, but for now, it's enough to know that this pushed video games in a direction of focusing a little more on things like setting and character and story than games previously had, which means, of course, that they developed in a slightly different direction. Even in older video games that were far more based on the challenges of gameplay, the setting and design could be a major element. Castlevania, for instance, is known for its grueling difficulty, but its gothic design and vampire mythos is still a huge part of its identity, inseparable from the gameplay as part of what makes Castlevania what it is. In short, video games have just grown to be more than the thing that they were inspired by. This medium, this growing, developing art form, simply can't be said to be the same thing as other games just on a television screen. You can't look at Uncharted 4 and say that it's basically the same thing as poker just because both of them have rules, goals, and fail states. Even completely competitive games like Overwatch or even Call of Duty's multiplayer have artistic and atmospheric elements that go entirely beyond the basic framework of a game. All that to say, video games, despite having the word game in the title, are not the same thing as a traditionally defined game, and it would be a pretty big mistake to treat them in exactly the same way. That said, these basic elements of game design still obviously play a very important and prominent role in this medium, so it's absolutely worth understanding their place within it. And this is where we come back to the question. Are art games like Dear Esther, visual novels like Analog: A Hate Story, and narrative experiments like Her Story games? Well, in a technical sense, and based on the traditional concept and definition of a game, probably not. There's no challenge, no fail states, just kind of an experience to work through. There is still a goal, I suppose, but since there's no challenge or way to fail at getting there, it ends up being no more a game-like challenge than being able to read and turn pages to get through a book. So yeah, I'd feel comfortable saying that things like art games and visual novels are not, technically speaking, games. At least I would feel comfortable saying that, except that unfortunately this discussion is almost never used to gain a better understanding of this medium and our experiments within it, but rather to exclude and devalue experiences that we don't like or understand. And that's the big problem with this whole discussion. It's almost never used in a constructive way. This question is worth asking, and it's definitely worth discussing and considering, but it's very, very rarely actually framed in such a way that helps anything. Using the aforementioned Dear Esther as an example, the debate was dominated not by people who were trying to figure out how this fits into our concepts of what a video game is, or trying to better understand the nature of an electronic interactive work of art separate from game mechanics and challenges, but because some people thought it was boring and they didn't want to acknowledge it as part of the medium they enjoyed. People saw that it didn't have traditional elements of a game like challenges, goals, and fail states, and dismissed it because it's not even a game. But there is nothing to be gained from hand-waving atypical experiences that we don't understand. This medium grows through experimentation, and to immediately dismiss a game where we don't shoot anyone or jump over any bottomless pits is counterintuitive to that goal. So sure, Dear Esther and its ilk aren't, on a technical level, games. But what does that actually mean? Remember how I said that video games aren't the same thing as traditional games? Well, this is where that comes in. Just because the word game is in the title, and just because this medium started off focusing on pretty traditional concepts of game design, doesn't mean that it's not going to grow and evolve into its own entity. And it's been growing into a lot of really interesting and experimental directions lately. As it's done so, there's been a lot of experimentation and a lot of new ideas being tried, and some of those ideas don't fit too well with the typical concept of a game at all. And you know what? That's fine. The claim that a video game loses its value as a video game if it doesn't have traditionally defined gameplay is based on the idea that gameplay is what makes this medium unique, and that's just not the case. I'll refer back to Passage, which I talked about in detail in my analysis on assorted art games. There's no challenge, there's no way to win or lose, no gameplay in a traditional sense, but there's absolutely no question that it is what it is because it's interactive. Passage could not have been a book, or a movie, or a song, or a stage play. It is a digital work of art that is heavily based on the player's interaction with it. It may not have gameplay per se, it may not be a game, but it definitely is a video game. At absolute worst, This means that the medium's name isn't 100% accurate to each of its works, and that's just really not a problem at all. We simply have an art form called video games that over time and development have expanded to more than the original concept was. Isn't it better to let video games expand and grow than to limit them based on the technical definition of a concept we originally based them on? Ultimately, it's perfectly legitimate to claim that some video games are not technically games. But once we get out of the realm of technical definitions, we tend to take a wrong turn. They may not be games, but they are still digital, interactive works of art that are worth no more or less than more gamey examples of this medium. And it's kind of absurd to exclude them on a technicality like that. So whether you agree or disagree, I hope you learned a bit more about this issue through this video, and you can feel free to leave your comments below either way. Also below is a subscribe button that you should definitely click on, as well as some links to Games as Literature on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon, the latter of which I suggest you visit if you want to support the show. Next time, we're giving a full-on literary analysis to the strange avian love story, Hatoful Boyfriend. So, until next time, class dismissed.